Hey guys, this is Elena Singanli from We Learn to Share. Welcome to the video of AP US history. In this video, we're gonna go over the presidency of Richard Nixon. So this is the timeline we have today. So take a moment to look at the whole overview. So let's first start from the keywords. So the presidency of Richard Nixon was from 1969 to 1974. He got re-elected in the election of 1972. And the keyword would definitely be Watergate, Detente, SALT, and ABM. They're both treaties that Nixon signed with the Soviet Union and also to Vietnamize the strategy that Nixon took in the war or affairs in Vietnam and also new federalism. And Richard Nixon was Republican, and maybe it'll be easier for you to remember him as a Republican if you recognize that they both start with R's. Okay, so Richard Nixon was a career politician, meaning that he had been a politician for most of his life. He is a native Californian. He was a vice president to Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower from 1952 to 1960. Remember the Checkers speech in which Eisenhower declared Nixon to be his vice president, and his craving or his wanting to become the president first arose in 1960, but he lost the election of 1960 to John F. Kennedy. You could check out this video right over here if you haven't watched the presidency of John F. Kennedy. Okay, moving back. So, and the second chance of him to win the election came on 1968 after 8 years, and it was against Democratic candidate Hubert Humphrey. And this was basically because the time in 1968 was when the Democratic Party was kind of a mess. They were disarrayed, kind of chaotic because of Vietnam, while the Republicans were good and united under Nixon. But even though Nixon was elected, the Democrats still controlled both House of Congresses, and this would basically affect the domestic, especially the domestic affairs and the policies that Nixon would undertake in his presidency. And Nixon wasn't a huge supporter, but did little to roll them back because he chose to spend political capital for U.S. foreign policy. It means that basically Nixon focused mainly outside of U.S., promising that he will bring peace with honor after years of Vietnam. So, in this first video, we're going to first look at Nixon's presidency and Nixon's policy regarding Vietnam. So, during his election in 1968 against Democratic candidate Hubert Humphrey, Nixon said that he is going to carry out a secret plan to get U.S. out of Vietnam. Remember, the war in Vietnam was very, very unsupported and very, very not delightful for the U.S. citizens. Many of US citizens at this time were against US involvement in Vietnam. So he had two major plans. Two major parts in the secret plan. First was Vietnamization. This is a strategy that he called, of which he will gradually bring US troops back to US. So he will withdraw US troops. So it did reduce to 50,000 by 1973. However, that's not the end because he's going to Vietnamize the whole war, meaning that he will now train South Vietnam peoples or South Vietnam soldiers, right, to fight on their own while US will support them. So even though he was kind of bringing out US people out of the war, the US is still being engaged in the war because they're Vietnamizing or training South Vietnamese to become soldiers to fight the war. And then the second part of here is the Cambodia invasion. So Cambodia was a neighboring country of Vietnam, and Cambodia was officially neutral but was a conduit for North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops. So that's why he decided to invade here, and it set off waves of protests again around the nation, especially university camps. And in 1970, there was an incident in Ohio, in Kent State University, in which the Ohio governor had the national army to set down this whole revolt or this whole protest going on in Kent State University, and it kind of killed several young people, and that incident had really shocked the whole nation. And you can also remember that among these times, actually US had invaded to neighboring countries like Cambodia and also to Laos, and that would actually gradually become exposed by a series of papers that exposed that the US government and Nixon was lying to the American citizens that they're withdrawing from the Vietnam War in a series called Pentagon Papers, which we're going to look right over here. So, but before we go over here, we can have that there is 1973. So Nixon actually signed ceasefire in Vietnam, but it gained few concessions. That's because even though he signed a treaty for ceasefire in Vietnam in 1975, at the end of the day, North Vietnamese conquered southern capital, and therefore they united Vietnam under a communist government. So even though they had fought for war, U.S. had fought for war and being engaged in the war for upholding democracy and the democratic government, at the end of the day, they lost. Or, yeah, we can technically say that they lost because at the end of the day, North Vietnam had conquered and unified Vietnam, and Vietnam was under a communist government. And then there was 1973, the War Powers Act passed, which prevented the president from sending troops to a foreign country more than 60 days without a vote by Congress. Remember that there was an incident called Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 1964 by President Lyndon B. Johnson. That was basically the president's being able to send troops without the consent of the Congress or without necessarily declaring war by the Congress, wherever they want for the protection of the rights or protection of the U.S. people in another country. So that is how the whole Vietnam War became so triggered and how U.S. became more involved in the whole war, right? So this War Powers Act, you can remember that it severely curtailed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution because now it's putting a 60-day limit. So the president could only send the soldiers to another country without the consent of the Congress only until 60 days. And this is the Pentagon Papers again, which exposed the U.S. government lying to the citizens of America and how they had secretly invaded Cambodia and Laos at that time. Okay, so that was basically Nixon's engagement in or his policies regarding Vietnam. Now let's look at Nixon's engagement or his policy in foreign affairs. So I told you from our first part that basically Nixon focused more on the policies outside of US. So let's look at two main things that had done. But before we go on, we have to see how the world was like at this time. So at this time, everything was about the Cold War and between the ideological conflict between US and USSR, between democracy and communism. And at this time, there was a Sino-Soviet rift, and this is basically when communism split. So there were two umbrellas under communism. So first was initially there were only USSR, and every communist country had to obey and are under USSR. But now China, especially under the leader Mao, who thought that, maybe we have to have our own communism that's called Maoism that focus more on agriculture aspects. And so, yeah, but you don't have to go deeper into that part because that's kind of more of a world history. But anyway, so you can just remember that there was two umbrellas of communism. So initially there was only USSR. So USSR was like the sole leader, but now we have USSR and China. And there are several different countries that belonged under their under their umbrella. So for USSR, it was Laos and Vietnam. And for China, it was Cambodia and North Korea. And I thought this is important because Nixon, in his well-known ping-pong diplomacy, he had taken advantage of the Sino-Soviet rift. So what he did in ping-pong diplomacy was reopen relationship with China, like pretend or like actually become friends with China, so that USSR, right, would be very anxious about this relationship. So let's look more into the ping-pong diplomacy. So this is basically reopening relationship with China, and it is reopening the relationship because U.S. Initially refused to recognize the relationship with China, or refused to recognize China as a country since China's Communist Revolution in 1949. So, but at this time, so Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and Nixon both agreed, or they brought more policies that would reopen the relationship with China. And this is successfully exploring the rift between USSR and China. And so over here, we see that 1972, Nixon and Pat Nixon, which was the first president, wife of Nixon, took 2-week-long public relations trips to China. And this is basically called ping-pong diplomacy because, yeah, it came from the word ping-pong, the game, right? Because U.S. and China exchanged ping-pong players, and U.S. ping-pong team was invited to China to compete, but normally Americans weren't allowed to China because of communism, and again because U.S. did not recognize China as their as a country or develop develop more diplomatic relationship with them because they were communists, right? And this, at the end of the day, let Nixon and Mao become friends. And so you can see how at the end of the day, this ping pong diplomacy would kind of made USSR very anxious, right? So over here, we have the Tente with Soviet Union. This is another major policy success under Nixon's presidency. So the Tente basically means relaxing tension between the two nations. So basically this was between Nixon and Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. And there are severally two treaties that were signed at this time. So it's 1972 anti-ballistic missile ABM treaty. So this limited defensive missiles and it permitted both countries to deploy to two fixed ground-based defense sites of 100 missiles interceptor each. So it kind of really reduced the number of defensive missiles that each country could possess. And then this is the most well-known and should remember important thing, because this is called SALT, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. And this suspended the building of nuclear weapons, and put all sorts of limits on nuclear warfare. And so it kind of made the reduced number of nuclear missiles in their arsenals. Remember, this is very important, and the key thing to remember over here is nuclear weapons, that it was to reduce the number of nuclear missiles and weapons in both countries, in USSR and US. And this was a policy of the Tente by Nixon. Okay, now let's look at some domestic affairs. What kind of approach or policies did Nixon undertook in his presidency? So I've told you in our first part of the video that even though Nixon was elected, who was a Republican at the election of 1968, still the Democrats dominated both House and Senate, so both houses of Congress. And this means that it's kind of hard for the president, for Nixon, to control, or not to control, or to influence, or kind of make crafty domestic affairs, domestic policies in his own taste, in his Republican taste, because basically the branch of government that makes laws is the legislative branch, which is the House and Senate. And so this domination of Democrats in both House and Senate in the Congress led the 1970s, the legislations in 1970s to look similar as those ones in 1960s. Remember, in 1960s we had like Lyndon B. Johnson and John F. Kennedy, and we also had several really important legislations like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, all which extended or which advocated for civil rights and really helped desegregate the South and also advocate for the Black people, right? So it means that, so basically let's look at Nixon's liberalism. So I initially told you that he is a Republican, and hence he is not a big fan of like extension of social liberty or welfare things, like more liberal things, because he's a conservative. But still, he had some liberalism within his domestic policy because Democrats dominated both House and Senate. So let's look at one policy. It's called AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children. This was a policy passed by Nixon, by during Nixon's presidency, and it also expanded government programs and social welfare. Spending for social programs increased during the first years of Nixon administration. For example, there was expansion to Social Security, increased food stamps, which is the government supporting or subsidizing or giving help to people, poor people, for food. And there were extension of Medicaid benefits. Remember Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare was for the support of elderly, and Medicaid was for the support of these medical things for the poor people, right? It's to aid the poor. And so also there was new funding for art and cancer research, and poverty drops to 11% by 1973. And there was also Philadelphia Plan in 1969, which took the first word affirmative action. And Nixon also passed the EPA in 1970, the Environmental Protection Agency, to combat pollution. And there was Title IX or 9, which advocated for the protection for female university students. And now let's look at the part of the Supreme Court. So Nixon kind of hoped that by appointing right-leaning Supreme Court justices like Warren Burger and William Rehnquist would actually counteract the liberal rulings of 50s and 60s. However, it actually increased conservative court largely upheld. It actually made the conservative court to upheld early decisions, and they even ruled for in the case Roe versus Wade for advocating for abortion, saying that abortion was a matter of private things between the woman and the doctor, and also allowed abortion in the first trimesters of pregnancy. And also, however, under Warren Burger's court, there were mixed records on racial issues, because even though there were extension of affirmative action protections, simultaneously, the Burger court ruled against busing students, remember, like the freedom riders, right? Busing students to combat de facto segregation in the southern parts. So you can remember that under Burger court, even though most of things were liberal, there were still some mixed records and some ambivalent issues regarding racial issues. And then regarding to economy, there are something called new federalism, because this is basically a term that is mostly associated with Nixon's domestic economic policies, because basically he provided block grants to states, allowing them, and grants it's something like you want to learn this more in AP US government, but just to explain a little, so grants would be a subsidy given by the branch, or given by the federal government to the state government. And there are several types of grants. So there are like the block grants, and there are other types of them too. But one type of them, block grants, is basically giving grants, so subsidies to states, block or in blocks, or meaning without like, so giving more freedom to the states, because they won't check how much or where they would spend these monies. So it's really up to the states. So it kind of allowed them to decide how money was to be sent or was to be spent. And this kind of resulted in reducing the size of the federal government, because they're no longer really keeping their eyes closed on how these monies are spent, but it's really up to the states, and they trusted the states, that's why. And then in terms of economics, however, it's evaluated that his policies they tried to combat the stagflation, the economic issues, however failed to cope with the growing issues of stagflation, which is a combination of, especially after the Vietnam War, a combination of inflation, high prices, price inflation, and high unemployment. And in 1971, Nixon announced a policy of 90 wage and price freeze. And in order to increase American exports, he took the dollar off the gold standard, meaning that he no longer had the dollar to be based on the gold standard. However, neither solutions did much to revive American economy. Okay. So, in today's video, we've learned about the Nixon's presidency. We've learned about Nixon in Vietnam, his foreign affairs, his foreign policies, and his domestic policies. In the next video, we're going to learn about the Watergate scandal, which is very, very important regarding Nixon's presidency, and also in U.S. history and U.S. politics, because this became the event in which made the American citizens to support a conservative government, and did not trust the government, started to mistrust the government. Okay, so we're going to learn about this in our next video. And thanks for watching today's video, and see you in the next video.